Our next discussion brings together two thought-provoking essays that offer different yet complementary perspectives on how AI can be integrated to strengthen democratic governance and civic engagement. These two essays explore insights that range from national governance to the very fabric of our local communities. So I'm delighted to welcome Laura Bisesto, Chief of Staff to the Chief Financial Officer at OpenAI and the former Global Head of Policy and Privacy at Nextdoor, where she oversaw global content policy, AI ethics, public policy, privacy, and regulatory compliance. Andrew Sorota, the editorial and strategy lead at the office of Eric Schmidt, where he works on special projects across AI and global affairs. Andrew was part of Eric's writing team for this essay. And also, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, who needs no introductions, Sandy Pentland, one of the faculty leads of this project and co-author with Lily Chai on the essay you heard about previously. So a round of applause.
Yay.
Thank you so much.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you for staying, and hope we'll make it worthwhile here. The little Slido thing believes it needs to get a security update, so we'll see if we can battle with it and make it happen. So, welcome. We have Andrew and Eric Smith's paper, which essentially, I think, talks about sort of top-down uses of AI to help things like AI for Congress, AI in emergencies, things like that. And so that's a perspective, but of course that extends down. And we'll talk about how that interacts with finer-grained governance. And then Laura and Sarah Fryer's grassroots paper, which has to do with building community, maintaining sort of the human touch within communities to be able to come to things that communities really want, right? And so the issues here, which I want to explore in this little discussion, are these different scales. How do they fit together? If communities decide different things, how does that work up at the national scale? If the national scale says X, what happens if the communities aren't happy with that? And those involve questions of power and agency, you know, who actually gets to make the choices, safety, and not just the security update from Slido here. And this notion of being human-centered. I mean, the whole point here, in some degree, is to make sure that this is around humans determining their future, not AI determining our future. AI should be helping us. This was the point of the paper with Lily and myself, is that, you know, we need to preserve human agency in all of this. And that's a little bit of a slippery slope in many ways. Let's start with Laura. And so the idea that is central, I think, in your paper is that AI has to be grounded in the human condition, in human relationships. This is how we make decisions, how we grow, how we decide what is appropriate for us, and local context. Different communities are very different. So one size fits none is a famous saying in the EU. Let's not do that here. Right? And the question is then, how are we going to maintain sort of the human nature of communities and their agency while having AI becoming more and more a part of the fabric of our lives? So.
Well, thanks so much, Sandy. Appreciate being here. For context, Sarah Fryer, who was the former CEO of Nextdoor, and I, when I was the global head of policy and privacy, we wrote this essay together when we were at Nextdoor. There we were focused on how can AI-enabled platforms really create community connectedness, which we believe is the bedrock of a healthy democracy. And now we're both at OpenAI. She's the CFO, I'm her chief of staff, and we feel like this essay is particularly relevant as OpenAI is really focused on its mission of making sure there's access to AI that benefits all of humanity. So we're happy to see that it's translated to our new roles. But really importantly, we think that AI-enabled platforms can do a number of things to help the local community. Of course, I think at the highest level, people are familiar with the best cases, healthcare, education, different areas of high level of academic study. But I think people overlook the local benefits that AI could bring. For example, in a community, not only can it better connect neighbors, enable them to communicate with each other if they speak different languages, for example, or have a different way of saying things. But it could also help small businesses, which are a really important fabric of any community, helping them create messaging for their constituencies, helping them create advertisements really simply, and also local government connecting with its constituency, making sure that it can do something as simple as translate to diverse populations. So I think there's a number of different things that AI-enabled platforms can do, but what we argue in our essay is that there's a real potential to use it as a tool to increase connectedness at the local level among neighbors and local government.
That's great. So Andrew, you want to go next here? So you have a paper with Eric Schmidt, and it focuses on the top-down perspective and gives examples of helping, AI helping Congress make decisions. And the one that attracts most attention is AI in the Situation Room. You have some crunch, you think the world's falling apart, and the AI is telling you push the button, right? That's the nightmare sort of thing, or the characterization. So the questions then are obviously, how do you maintain safety, human values in this sort of situation? Because we all know that when you're under time pressure, you make decisions which are much less considered and deliberative. And in the essay, you suggest things about strong leadership and skills. And many people would say that we have a sort of paucity of strong leadership at the moment. So that raises that sort of question. So what sort of skills? What sort of leadership?
Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here, to be participating in this really exciting and forward-looking project, and to be speaking with Laura. And I know that the framing of the conversation is very much that we're approaching this from different perspectives, but I'm excited to sort of explore and unpack where the alignment is, because I think there's a lot. Okay, so there were a bunch of questions there, and I'm going to try to unpack them each individually. So first, on the top-down idea, I want to interrogate that a bit more, because I understand the interpretation in that way, kind of top-down, but I might categorize it as something a little different. So I think in thinking through this essay, the perspective that Eric was coming to the table with was from the question, what is imperfect about human decision making? And if we can't perfect it, how can we at least make it better? And so the point here being that humans, we face all of these different kinds of constraints when we make decisions, constraints around time or information or our own individual biases, and AI could potentially help overcome those constraints. And so this is true for the most consequential decisions at the highest level of government, but it's also true on a local level in decisions individuals make in their everyday lives. And so I think we want to kind of center that thinking in each of these different use cases. And so to the point on AI in the Situation Room, I think this one is maybe the flashiest and gets the most attention precisely for that reason, right? That we're envisioning these like really high stakes environment where a decision needs to be made immediately, and perhaps there's a crisis or something like that. And I actually think it's really quite illustrative of an example as one of these cases where humans are facing major constraints, and AI can help overcome them, right? So we can envision several different use cases for AI in the Situation Room in particular. One of them would be the ability to synthesize input from a huge range of experts, right? So just simply a far greater number of experts than you would be able to individually speak with, like one-on-one, given the time constraints. A second use case would be using AI as a predictive tool. So potentially simulating different outcomes, different consequences that a particular decision might lead to, and so forth. And you raise the question of risks, which is obviously very important. Anyone that has used an LLM, at least in its current state, knows that these models lie or they make up information. And so we obviously from the start need to think about how we protect against that. And I think there are some simple things we can do to protect against it, and I think you were signaling to some of them. One would be to make sure that all of the information that's generated by an AI model is checked by a human being. That the contributions from the model are but one of many inputs that a decision maker is considering in making their decision. And so it's not when you're in a moment of crisis, you feel the frenzy, and so you just point to the button that the AI tells you to do. And in fact, that leads maybe to the last point, which is that it's a very different thing to develop an AI model to be an autonomous decision maker versus to develop a model that is supposed to augment human decision making. And so I think even before the implementation of the AI model, in the actual development of it, I think taking this kind of human-centered approach is really important. And then just the last point on leadership, I suppose, and then I'll pass it back to Laura, would be that I think we need to talk about leadership more in the context of AI, because the decisions that we make now about how AI will be integrated into governance will have impacts for decades to come. And so I think as an analogous example, I just got back from Estonia last week, where they have one of the most sophisticated digital republics in the world. And so Larry was talking earlier about how magical it seemed that during COVID we were able to order COVID testing kits online. In Estonia, that is child's play, right? So all of their digital public services, or rather all of their public services are digitalized and online, from the storing of your healthcare data to the way that you pay your taxes to even voting. And the reason for this opportunity in Estonia was because of decisions that Estonian leaders made in the early 2000s. Just a few Estonian presidents decided that they were going to invest in this digital public infrastructure, and as a result, Estonia can now reap the benefits of that, which in the United States sounds really foreign as a concept. And so in thinking through the kinds of skills that we can try to teach our leaders now, I think tangibly there is a certain degree of tech literacy that all leaders should have. They should be well versed in how the technology operates in order to be able to fully understand its opportunities, and then obviously its risks and its fallibility. And I also think that this is true not just of leaders, but of ordinary citizens, that they should have the same kind of education, especially if we believe that AI will enable a much more profound connection between citizen and policy-making process, then citizens too should be much better versed in the way these technologies operate. And then aside from the tangible skills, I would say that there's also a certain mindset that leaders should have. So one that is a democratic mindset that thinks about implementing these technologies in an inclusive manner, as we've been hearing about all afternoon, in a way that makes citizens feel like they're actually being brought on board. And we can talk more about that.
Okay, so first let me mention that I worked for those presidents.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason they did that is because they were scared to death of Russia. Okay, they figured we got to go all digital or we're doomed. And let me go a little bit off and sort of give an example that you guys can disagree with. So it's always struck me that, like, the International Panel on Climate Change, right, uses 10 of their 20 of the largest AIs in the world to think about climate change. And that's an example of right at the top decision making. But the same type of thing is for your daily weather report, when they show where the rivers are coming, or and everyone's very used to that, but that's very local. And maybe that sort of thing provides some sort of maybe some of that sort of model for some of the things. But the question really is for both of you, whoever wants to go first, maybe Laura, because you didn't get to to do it first. You're next, right? Is think about how this top-down and bottom-up are going to work. What are the implications for leadership? What happens when they disagree with each other? What happens with the ethics? I mean, want to say a little about that?
Yeah, thank you. I think, first of all politics is local. So I think it's critical that everyone from the neighbor level to local government to higher levels of government are able to use these new tools to help them be more efficient and effective leaders and to become more educated on the issues before them. I think that's a really critical part of it. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of different use cases here that you're bringing up, and that I think all of us really focus on the highest level, but there's a lot of opportunity for folks to just connect with each other and debate these issues, and also in a very unbiased way or very kind of objective way, receive information from some of these AI products out there, which I think is really critical. And I think it's important that everyone's able to access them. So you're sort of heading there, but I think there's, continues to remain a digital divide in the world, and that's of huge concern, so that people are even able to access the internet and these products, no less. But I think those are some sort of really big overarching themes I'm thinking about as we talk about the importance for local connection. But I think all politics is local is really what I'm thinking, and I think AI brings the ability to democratize communications to a whole different group of people that may not have been able to engage in the political process beforehand, whether they have a diverse language that's not as commonly used, they don't have an understanding of how local government works. I think all of that you can use tools in AI to better communicate in different ways and reduce misunderstandings among groups.
I completely agree, and I think Saffron was also talking about this earlier, is deploying these tools on low stakes, maybe more local issues as a way to start and at least make citizens feel acquainted with the technology before they then become integrated into higher levels of government, and I think that's key. And then you raised the point of leadership, just to maybe articulate a bit more clearly what are some principles that leaders at higher levels of government should use to maybe bring along the decision makers in mid and lower tier governments. In the essay, Eric focuses on two main principles. Those are explainability and accountability. And so by accountability, the idea is essentially just that, I guess, regardless of the degree to which an AI model is integrated into a decision-making process, there should be a human who takes responsibility for that decision, and who can be actively responsible for questions or complaints from citizens on how that decision is then implemented in the quote-unquote real world. And then explainability is really accountability, just in a different way, right? It's providing an account for something, being able to explain to citizens how you reached a certain decision, what trade-offs you considered, and indeed how the technology was incorporated into your decision-making process.
So before we came out here, we talked a little bit about what happens when communities decide different things, and that's yet different from the global decision. Who wins? How do you mediate between this community wants this, that community wants that, the federal government wants something different? How do you make sure that A, it works, and B, that it preserves, autonomy, that it's ethical, and so forth?
Yeah, one of the things that struck me when I was reading your essay is that, will there be an increase in direct democracy as a result of these new tools? Will that happen? I mean, I think the reality is that a lot of government institutions have been around now several hundred years at the very least, if we're looking at one of the newest democratic institutions in the world. And they may not change overnight, but I think what we've seen in California and what we've seen in other places is an increase in direct democracy when people are not happy with how the process is working. Whether that's good or bad, I think, is up for debate. But I think that's one issue that really came to mind when you're talking in your paper about how the highest levels of government may handle getting this kind of feedback from society.
Yeah, but we were talking a little bit about like the proposition system in California, which is definitely, the people raising their hand, but it's not a coherent process, as almost everybody will admit.
That's true. And I mean, I think that AI-enabled tools could help local governments at least facilitate more conversations and get more feedback from constituents. Arguably, you're still serving your constituents as representatives, so you should be, voting or acting on their behalf. So, I mean, we still have a representative democracy. The disagreements can only last for so long before you get voted out of office, arguably.
Yeah.
So I think part of the reason why referendums have not succeeded in California, at least, I mean, they have succeeded to a greater degree in places like Switzerland and elsewhere, but at least in California, I think the issue is that they're used as kind of the first mechanism of gauging public opinion, right? So it's without engaging in a deliberative process first, let's just kind of test how the population thinks about something, because the sad reality is that in the United States, we do not have very much of a deliberative society. And so as a result, if you just start with a referendum from the start, then you have a suboptimal outcome. So I think to the question of will there be more direct democracy, perhaps should we want it is a different question, but I think something that maybe everyone can agree on is that there at least seems like there's a much greater demand for direct participation among citizens, right? And that might be different than direct democracy, because we can imagine, as we've been hearing experiments about, direct participation from citizens that is then fed into a different kind of decision-making process, or a kind of mass deliberation of citizens that understands participation as a different way than this purely aggregative measure. But I think it's an interesting question about what to do when communities disagree.
Yeah, that's actually the core, is that there are going to be real conflicts.
There will be.
Now what?
But that's not a new problem, right? It's
No.
not introduced by AI that a local community might disagree with a national decision. And I think maybe that the federal model has it right in that there are certain decisions that are better made at different levels of governance. So, and I think that there are kind of risks that fall in both directions. So I agree that a lot of politics is local, and you don't want to just decide everything at a global level. That would be utterly ridiculous. But there are certain problems, I think, that are uniquely global and that require a certain degree of global coordination, where if we are too afraid to engage with the idea of scale at all, then we kind of prohibit ourselves from being able to equip ourselves with the tools to be able to solve them effectively. And so this is true for climate change, but it's also true for things like the actual governance of these technologies themselves.
I think there's a lot of potential, actually, for AI-enabled platforms to, if designed with pro-social initiatives in mind, to really encourage people to see different points of view. Again, it's a very objective way of sharing different sides. It may not be your neighbor saying the other side of the coin, but if you have this objective AI tool that's able to share that, maybe it actually can bring us more together than tear us apart than before. And I think there's been some studies of that. Maybe out of Duke had one study about controversial conversations and using an AI-enabled platform to try to mediate and bring people along on both sides. So I think there's a lot of potential for that. And that's one of the things we explore in our paper, is the ability for pro-social design in terms of architecture as well as product features to make people have more engaging conversations with fewer misunderstandings and to see different sides of an issue.
I want to go off script again. I'm going to get killed later. It's okay. So the skeleton in the closet is not around deliberation or democracy, but about bureaucracy. So we can decide things, but that doesn't make it happen. It's all those people who are trying not to get fired, who are following the rules, that actually execute those things. And a lot of the problems seem to come from that, and the lack of adaptability to local conditions, the lack of resources, perhaps, or feedback. What do you think about that? I mean, how can you make sure that the things that people want actually happen?
So two things. There's the problem with bureaucracy, but then there's the problem with elected officials, right? And those are two different things.
Okay.
No, but
Yeah. Okay.
But seriously, right? So we can think of several instances in which it's clear what the public wants, and that doesn't mean that the elected officials then implement that. Even in a kind of legislative process, before you get to the implementation question from bureaucrats. And so I think one example that we were discussing just briefly in the green room was that in France in 2020 and 2021, there was an experiment that the French government started called the Citizens Convention on Climate, where 150 citizens were randomly selected to convene in Paris and deliberate over the course of 7 weekends over several months on how France should essentially tackle the climate crisis. And so this was coming on the tail of the Yellow Vests movement, who were literally wearing neon yellow vests because they wanted to be seen and to be heard in response to the carbon tax that President Macron tried to implement in 2018. And so over the course of 7 months, these citizens were deliberating, and they created 149 proposals that the French government should implement. And these were really high-quality proposals, and the citizens were so invested in the deliberation process. And then at the end of it, of course, the bill gets diluted by the parliamentarians, and the bill is utterly unrecognizable. And so the citizens then feel totally disillusioned with the process and more unhappy with government institutions than they were before they were even included in the process. And so I think, and Saffron was talking about this earlier, there's a problem about implementation, which surely AI could help with in terms of allowing for better governance and more tailored governance to local contexts, just based on the aggregation of data from those areas. But then there's a separate question of, well, if we are able to use AI tools to generate public input, how do we ensure that that input is then integrated into the decisions of elected officials? Yeah.
So we work with the EU AI Act, the people who actually wrote it, and they described this sort of horror show of what should be done and that was actually approved by the administration and the bureaucracy. I think it's interesting that bureaucracies draw their model from armies. Right? In the early 1800s, it's like, well, how should we make a lot of people behave? Like the army, put the colonel in charge, right? And maybe we need to think of that sort of thing a little bit, right?
Yeah, I think AI is definitely a tool that can be used to improve bureaucracy, which I don't think is always a four-letter word, which is kind of how we're talking about it up here. But I think there's probably a lot of due process built into democracy, or in bureaucracy and democracy, and making sure that everyone has a fair opportunity to get the resources they need. And I think that AI, though, hopefully with the right education for people, I think importantly at the neighbor level, local government, and high levels of government, just getting an understanding of how to use this tool to become more efficient could start streamlining things. I think that there's, and also improve access to that bureaucracy for some groups that may not have had easy access before. I think a lot of us struggle with dealing with bureaucracy. Someone gave the post office example before, or DMV, I think, is a clear example for a lot of us. But, think about how difficult it would be even if you, were from a different country, or you were new and you didn't have the same language capabilities or understanding of how this even worked. I think there's a lot of potential for AI tools to improve that kind of bureaucracy and make it better. And I think it's an education issue is really what it is.
And just to piggyback off of that, because I think that's the key point that maybe connects these two ideas between good governance and civic engagement, which is that perhaps, and I think this is a key theme of Jennifer Palka's essay as well, which is the idea that a lot of the disillusionment we're seeing from citizens that is causing them to disengage from democratic processes is because these democratic governments are not delivering good results. And so if we think about how we can use AI for better governance and for better decision making and to yield better results, and this can actually do a lot in kind of rebuilding civic trust and public trust and these community bonds that have disappeared over the past few decades.
So why don't we go to some of the questions from the audience here? And Slido did not have a security update, so these may be interfered with by foreign agents, but let's see what we've got here. So the one at the top is, can you really envision what mid-level institutions or organizations are key to resolving the sorts of things that you're talking about? What does the resolution between local and global actually look like? What sort of institution? I mean, you've talked about the principles, about the ideas, but you didn't talk about how you're going to do it, right?
So the question is, what would a good...
What's the mid-level institutions that tie...
intermediary?
What's the institution design? Yeah.
I don't know if you necessarily need an institution to give AI-enabled tools to the masses and different levels of government. I think if that's part of the assumption that you do need an institution to implement all of this, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think there's AI-enabled platforms, of course, that can help convene, but I think that these tools should be accessible to everyone, no matter what. It shouldn't be something that you have to have an institution to implement. I think that's the point. I think it'll become ubiquitous, like the internet.
So the idea being, because I agree with it, that these AI tools can be used to generate and gather public input, and that input can then be interpreted and utilized by decision makers at every level, right? And so it doesn't necessarily require the creation of some sort of middle messenger to talk between the different levels of government.
So here's a interesting question from the audience. Do the panelists agree with the statement, AI can help aggregate preferences, but we will not create structural change? In other words, the people will say, we want this, but the institutions are the same, and you're likely to get the same result.
I agree that I don't necessarily think we'll see institutional change, especially that's written in constitutions, which I think is one of the questions. But I think the aggregation of preferences is really incredibly important, especially if it's coming, again, from diverse communities. Ultimately, the representative has to represent its constituents. If it doesn't, they'll be voted out of office. So I think there is checks and balances in place.
I guess I would say that I don't think AI in itself will create this kind of institutional restructuring, but I don't think it's impossible. And I think that the causes of it would be kind of different from just the existence of AI in itself and the capabilities that AI can produce in terms of aggregating preferences and allowing for new forms of governance, but there needs to be a different kind of shift in the public imagination of people that then leads to a new conception of what democracy is.
So here's another nasty question. Okay. So you said if the politicians don't agree with the constituents, they get voted out of office. But in fact, it's a lifetime appointment if you look at Congress, right? I mean, come on, right? Be realistic. And so the question here is, when politicians only do the bidding of big lobbies that donate to their campaigns, how are you going to get any sort of change?
I mean, again, this is just.
Am I being mean here?
No. I don't think that.
Interesting question.
That's mean. I think it's a certain diagnosis of the sad state of democracy today, and I think if the question is just how would we hold politicians accountable as it pertains to AI, that's a question as it pertains to any policy area. I mean, there's a question around. I'm a big fan of sortition-based bodies, so bodies based on random selection, because even if we were to remove all of those constraints and all of those flaws with the way that representative democracy works, you're still left with the idea of differentiating an elected official from one another, right? And so you're still discriminating along some axis, and we've decided that that is a kind of good thing because we can select for the best representatives. But it's an open question around whether what makes someone appealing to an electorate is what makes them a good legislator. So that's just to say there are certain faults and symptoms that we're seeing in democratic institutions that are plagued by too much money or by polarization or what have you. But really, the disease is not those symptoms, but more so the way that institutions are structured. And so it would take a rethinking of the way those institutions are structured in order to solve the problems. I understand that's a little circular, but it's necessary.
Or what do you think?
I think arguably if you have better connection at the local level, at the neighborhoods, and people are more empowered to have more knowledge, maybe we wouldn't have this sort of cynical point of view. Maybe there's a way to get, holistic, succinct information on your elected official. And I think AI right now could definitely solve that in the way it can aggregate massive amounts of information into very digestible snippets, especially if it comes to voting records, for example. That'd be one thing I think would be really interesting that people don't pay attention to. But again, the idea of this pro-social oriented architecture of an AI-enabled platform that allows for conversations to occur between neighbors and get more engaged in the local government process, I think has a lot of potential to maybe reverse that or start reversing that level of cynicism and bring more awareness to folks. All politics is local.
So I've seen here we have only 26 seconds left. So thank you both. This has been really interesting. I can see we can have much more conversation about the role of money in government and things like that and what we need to do with institutions. But thank you for contributing some really interesting perspectives, and I hope it was useful for you. And we can also see that there's some hope, right? We can improve communities and improve Congress and the White House. That's good. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.